It's Friday, it's 7:30 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. This week.
After years of unfair detention by the government of Iran, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anoosheh Ashoori have this afternoon finally been allowed to board a plane and leave the country.
At last, two British Iranian nationals are back in the UK. At Deputy Prime Minister's questions, Labour and the Conservatives debate links to Russia.
The former leader of the Labour Party was siding with Putin against the UK.
They cavort with Russian oligarchs in luxury villas while neglecting the security of the British people.
Members of the public offer to house Ukrainian refugees, but Labour wants more from the government.
The government's response to the Ukraine crisis has, quite frankly, been pathetic.
I'm just had it up to here with people trying to suggest that this country is not generous. So can we just chuck it when it comes to the partisan nonsense and get on with delivery?
In Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon says rules on face coverings should stay in place for now.
Given the current spike in case numbers, we consider it prudent to retain this requirement in regulation for a further short period.
Why won't the First Minister trust the Scottish public to take the steps they think are right to protect themselves and their families?
Well, as we saw there in the headlines, the moving and dramatic images of the story of the two people, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anoosheh Ashoori, returning to the UK, having been released from their imprisonment in Iran. Susan, how did that come about?
Well, isn't it lovely to have a happy story to talk about after all the talk of war and things recently? So, we had the release of actually three British Iranians. One has to stay there, two on their way home. The background to it, of course, is Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, the most famous of them, I suppose, was held for 6 years in Iran on various charges, but the general feeling was that she was being used as a bit of a bargaining chip. There have been false dawns before when we thought that she was going to get out and hopes were dashed. So it wasn't until the middle of the afternoon, when everyone was sure that she was actually on the plane and it had taken off, that the Foreign Secretary came to the Commons. Commons business was stopped in the middle of the afternoon so that the Foreign Secretary could make her statement about it. Now, she said it was diplomacy that had got them out. However, she did talk as well about the repayment of a debt to Iran of nearly £400 million. Now, this is money that Iran had paid to the UK decades ago for tanks, but the tanks were never delivered because the Shah who'd ordered them had fallen and the Iranian Revolution had taken place, so Britain didn't want to send the tanks and never did. So that money was repaid. However, the Foreign Secretary was extremely keen to stress that this was a parallel event and not a ransom payment. However, the mood generally was one of joy, and especially because Nazanin's husband, Richard, and her little girl were both in the public gallery up above to watch.
After years of unfair detention by the government of Iran, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anoosheh Ashoori have this afternoon finally been allowed to board a plane and leave the country. The repayment of the debt, in parallel with the release of our nationals, reflects steps taken by both the UK and Iran to resolve issues of serious disagreement between our two countries. We will continue to stand up for our interests, for the freedom and security of our nationals, wherever they are, and for an end to arbitrary detention. But for now, to Nazanin and Anoosheh, I am pleased that in just a few hours' time, we will be able to say, welcome home.
There are serious lessons that need to be learned from this appalling episode. We need stronger international measures to combat the use of arbitrary detention as a political tool, to end hostage diplomacy, and we need a review of these cases. We need to understand what could have been done by the British government to secure releases sooner.
There is a risk of moral hazard in this, where I think we're all agreed that this is historic debt that needed to be repaid. Others could take other lessons from this. And what assessment has been made of the risk of moral hazard to people, British citizens going to Iran, but also in other places of risk?
What we need to do is fundamentally change the incentives for governments so there is not an incentive to behave in this way.
Can I, most of all, though, commend the efforts of Richard Radcliffe, Nazanin's husband. His quiet courage, his humility, his total determination never wavered throughout 6 years of hell, and I think he was really the bravest person I met during my time as Foreign Secretary and an inspiration to many people.
I want to pay tribute to my constituent Richard Radcliffe for his relentless campaigning, but I also think he's really set the bar high for all husbands across the world. Can I say to Nazanin, welcome home after 6 long years. And can I say to Gabriella, this time, Mummy really is coming home.
Oh, yes, happy scenes there in the House of Commons. Tulip Siddiq, the local MP for Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who campaigned for many years. We also saw a moment ago, Susan, Angela Rayner and Dominic Raab standing in at Prime Minister's questions this week, if you like, the clash of the deputies. They were trying to accuse each other of having links to Russia. How did that debate unfold?
Yes, it was indeed Deputies' Day. So Boris Johnson was away in Saudi Arabia, but it was still really all about him. First, about that trip to Saudi Arabia at a very sensitive time, given that there have been a rash of more executions in Saudi Arabia, but also about his contacts with wealthy Russians, and in particular Lord Lebedev. Now, the Sunday Times has suggested that before he got his peerage, there were security concerns, and that Boris Johnson had acted to make sure that he got his peerage nonetheless. Now, Boris Johnson has denied that, but that came up at question time as well. Dominic Raab's answers were really all about the former Labour leader, Jeremy Coburn, the MP for Islington North, as he describes him, although he now sits as an independent.
There are now widespread reports that the Prime Minister did not accept warnings from our own intelligence services, granting a Russian oligarch, the son and business partner of a KGB spy, a seat here in this Parliament. It shouldn't matter if such a warning was about a close personal friend of the Prime Minister. It shouldn't matter if he gave the Prime Minister thousands of pounds of gifts, and it shouldn't matter how much champagne and caviar he serves. There's no ifs or buts when it comes to the safety of the British people.
The suggestion she's making is sheer nonsense. But if she wants to talk about national security, then I remind her that she and her shadow cabinet colleagues not so long ago wanted the honourable member for Islington North. Mr. Speaker, a man who wanted and talked about abolishing the army, pulling out of Trident, she voted for that.
This week, the Prime Minister has gone cap in hand from one dictator to another on a begging mission to the Saudi prince to bail him out. Mr. Speaker, the government have had 12 years to end their reliance on foreign oil and invest in homegrown energy to secure our supplies. Their failure has left us all vulnerable, reliant on another murderous dictator to keep the lights on and pumps open.
The Prime Minister was, as Foreign Secretary, galvanising the response to the nerve agent attack in Salisbury at the time where the honourable member, the former leader of the Labour Party, was siding with Putin against the UK. What did the honourable lady have to say on Sky News? He's a very strong leader. She can't wait for him to become Prime Minister.
They hiked tax on 27 million working people while the super rich increase their wealth. They watch energy prices rise by over 50% while the companies enjoy profits they didn't even expect. And they cavort with Russian oligarchs in luxury villas while neglecting the security of the British people.
We've also shown, Mr. Speaker, the big-hearted spirit of this government and indeed this nation, with the 5,500 visas granted to Ukrainians to come here, and also the humanitarian route, which has now got 100,000 sponsors applying to come to take Ukrainian families in these homes. While she's in her social media echo chamber, that's what this government is doing.
Passions running high there at Prime Minister's Questions this week. Susan, thank you very much for the moment. We'll come back to you shortly. Let's go to Holyrood now, find out what's been happening there with our reporter Jenny Davidson. Hello, Jenny. We saw in the headlines that there was an important announcement from the First Minister saying that the rules on face coverings will actually stay in place for a little bit longer. Why?
That's right. Face coverings continuing for a while yet here in Scotland as a legal requirement. Now, going back 3 weeks ago to the First Minister's last COVID update, she'd announced that she hoped to end all legal restrictions on the 21st of March, but that was based on there being no significant adverse developments with the virus. The hope was, of course, that cases would continue to go down. Now, in fact, instead, we've had a spike in cases here in Scotland, driven by that very transmissible BA2 variant of Omicron. Cases going from about an average of 6,900 per day 3 weeks ago up to around 12,000 per day this week, and hospitalisations, the number of people in hospital, going from just around 1,000 to closer to 2,000. So yes, most of the legal restrictions ending next Monday, but face masks to continue until the beginning of April here in Scotland.
The exception relates to the requirement to wear face coverings on public transport and in certain indoor settings. Given the current spike in case numbers, we consider it prudent to retain this requirement in regulation for a further short period. I know this will be disappointing for businesses and service providers such as daycare services. However, ensuring maximum continued use of face coverings will provide some additional protection, particularly for the most vulnerable, at a time when the risk of infection is very high, and it may help us get over this spike more quickly. We will review it again in 2 weeks before the Easter recess, and our expectation now is that this regulation will convert to guidance in early April.
It's true that case rates are higher at the moment than any of us would like. But COVID cases were always going to rise as restrictions were eased. We can't get complacent with COVID, but we have to move forward. We can't stay stuck with COVID rules forever. That's why it will be a blow for households and businesses that the First Minister has decided to keep the face mask rules in place. The Government said last month these would be removed on the 21st of March, but now that's being delayed. Why won't the First Minister trust the Scottish public to take the steps they think are right to protect themselves and their families? And why are we back to this wait-and-see approach again with no firm date to allow businesses and the public to plan ahead?
And the other update we heard this week was around COVID testing, which we had been expecting following the Prime Minister's announcement of the end of free testing from the 1st of April in England. So we've heard that free testing, COVID testing, is going to be winding down after Easter here in Scotland and moving to a kind of targeted phase of testing from the 1st of May.
Jenny, we've been talking about the refugee schemes over the past week. We've got Homes for Ukraine refugee scheme, but the Scottish Government has been talking about becoming what's called a super sponsor for Ukrainian refugees. What does that involve?
Well, the UK Government's Homes for Ukraine scheme, which launches today, that requires individuals to name the person that they want to host if they're going to sponsor a visa. Now, the Scottish Government is aiming to speed things up, to short-circuit that process, was the words used, by becoming a kind of high-level sponsor, initially for 3,000 refugees, and then over the longer term, at least 10% of those who come to the UK. So that means that individuals won't need to be matched to come to Scotland. 3,000 people would just be able to come here initially. The Scottish Government would then take responsibility for things like accommodation and support, and then worry about the longer term details later on.
Our aim is that our super-sponsor route will run in parallel with the first phase of the wider UK scheme. That should make it possible, and this is certainly our hope, for the first 3,000 displaced Ukrainians to begin arriving in Scotland from as early as this weekend. Now, I need to be clear that this is dependent on UK Government agreement. Only the Home Office can issue the visas. But there is no good reason, in my view, for this agreement not to be reached. We hope and expect that it will be, and crucially, this is the basis on which we are now planning.
It is very welcome that the Scottish and UK governments are working collaboratively to ensure that in Scotland we can provide that place of refuge, and I appreciate the additional detail we have just been given.
The UK Government has been slow in response to the refugee crisis, and I hope that they do waive the bureaucratic visa requirements. But there are 5,000 Ukrainians settled in Scotland, at least another 6,000 as seasonal workers, so it is clear to me that the SNP Government will need to offer more than the 3,000 places.
I welcome very much the announcement of the super sponsor scheme, and, Presiding Officer, we should be justifiably proud but not wholly surprised by the colossal response that we have seen, not just from the people in Scotland but across Great Britain, opening their homes to Ukrainians fleeing conflict.
Well, as you could hear there, the Ukraine situation, one that's transcending party politics and really bringing a bit more agreement between parties, and questions from the opposition were really about the practicalities of the support, things like health, things like language and integration of these refugees in Scotland once they arrive here.
Well, an issue that perhaps doesn't have party political agreement is over how to tackle the cost of living. It's an issue across the UK, Jenny, and of course we've got the Chancellor's spring statement here in Westminster next week. It was also debated at First Minister's Questions. What happened?
Well, indeed, and this was brought up by Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar in the context of that spring statement next week and what he wanted to see in it. Now, it's part of an ongoing discussion, of course, across the UK about cost of living, but a bit of an ongoing argument between Labour and the SNP around oil and gas and a windfall tax on that, going back several weeks. And Anas Sarwar complaining that SNP MPs hadn't supported a Labour proposal at Westminster for an oil and gas windfall tax, then claiming that an SNP proposal this week hadn't included oil and gas. The Nicola Sturgeon said it did, but was just wider than that. So that was one key strand of it. The other one was about the use of the £150 rebate on council tax announced by the Chancellor, how that was being distributed in Scotland and whether that was being done in the most optimal way. But part of an ongoing argument and discussion about what the best way is to deal with that cost of living crisis and what actions need to be taken.
Fuel is estimated to go up to over £2 a litre. Food prices are on the rise, and at the same time we have two governments lacking ambition, failing to back a windfall tax on the big energy companies that put money in people's pockets, failing to use its budget to support those most in need, making it worse by hiking rail fares and water charges, and failing to back detailed and costed plans just because they come from Labour. This crisis is only getting worse. Warm words won't keep the bills down.
This government doesn't have the power to impose a windfall tax. And let me be very clear, the motion tabled in the House of Commons yesterday by SNP MPs would include oil and gas companies. Any reading of that would lead anyone to that conclusion. But here, in the interest, because this is a really serious issue for families across the country, so in the interest of trying to build consensus, I will prepare and sign this afternoon a joint letter with Anas Sarwar to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, asking if they would pass us, asking them to do a windfall tax, but asking them, because I suspect their answer will be no, to give the power to this Parliament to do it at our own hand. And then we can join forces and ensure that is actually done with oil and gas companies and with Amazon and with other companies that have increased. So rather than just indulge in the rhetoric, will Anas Sarwar actually argue for the means for this Parliament to do it?
Well, as with many debates at Holyrood, the constitutional question comes into that, and disagreement over powers for Holyrood and who should make decisions, always a live issue here. But yes, all eyes going to be on the Chancellor's spring statement next week in terms of that cost of living challenge.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Jenny Davidson there at Holyrood. Let's return to Westminster and catch up with Susan. Tell us about the scheme the government has announced for the public to house refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine.
Yes, this is a scheme for people who don't have any family contacts in the UK. So people with spare accommodation in Britain can offer their spare accommodation to a Ukrainian refugee. Now, it was widely welcomed in the Commons, and indeed tens of thousands of people signed up for it in no time. However, there were some concerns about security and also about how it would work, because the government isn't going to match people up. People will have to offer the accommodation to a named Ukrainian refugees, and who knows the name of a Ukrainian refugee? Not very many of us, I suppose. Let's see what they had to say.
We're a proud democracy. All of us in this House wish to see us defend and uphold our values, and to stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies, and to offer a safe haven to people who have been forced to flee war and persecution. The British people have already opened their hearts in so many ways, and are hopeful that many will also be ready to open their homes and to help those fleeing persecution find peace, healing, and the prospect of a brighter future.
He can't seriously be asking Ukrainian families who are fleeing Vladimir Putin, who've left their homes with nothing, to get onto Instagram and advertise themselves in the hope that a British family might notice them. Is this genuinely the extent of this scheme? Surely there's a role for the Secretary of State in matching Ukrainian families to their sponsors, not just a DIY asylum scheme where all he does is take the credit.
She asks why it is. That we are requiring matching in the way that we are. It's because our scheme has been developed in partnership with non-governmental organisations who have welcomed our approach. We've been doing the practical work of ensuring that refugee organisations on the ground can help to shape our response in order to help those most in need.
As with previous refugee crises, the government's response to the Ukraine crisis has, quite frankly, been pathetic, revealing the true extent of the callousness within this government's hostile environment policy. And the only reason, by the way, that we're having such a statement, which in itself is wholly inadequate, is because the government has been dragged kicking and screaming by the opposition, the media and the good British people, who have said that this debacle simply doesn't represent us.
You know, we're going to disagree politically and all the rest of it, but I'm just had it up to here with people trying to suggest that this country is not generous. And all this stuff about hostile environment. The hostile environment was invented under a Labour Home Secretary. So can we just chuck it when it comes to the partisan nonsense and get on with delivery?
Well, that was Michael Gove there, answering rather angrily to questions about the scheme. Susan, another important ramification of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, of course, economic sanctions. And this week, the House of Lords was looking at some legislation on that particular issue. What is it?
Yeah, this is the other prong, if you like, of the government's reaction, which is to sanction individuals and try and clamp down on dirty money, which has been a sort of running sore over years. But now there's emergency action with some emergency legislation that's been hurried through Parliament, the Economic Crime Bill. It does a couple of things. It makes it harder for people to hide their money, and it also makes it easier to sanction oligarchs. So there was some concern, I think, in the House of Lords and from opposition parties that the bill as it stands would give people too much time to squirrel their money away first. So there were some suggestions in the House of Lords about how that could be toughened up.
It addresses the concerns that have been raised with me in both houses that corrupt people must not be allowed to sell up and escape the transparency that this register will bring. Now, it's my submission that this will be more effective than any further reduction in the transition period, which risks opening up the provisions of the register to legal challenge.
In the amendment put forward by myself and Baroness Kramer, which seeks to freeze assets on an interim basis where there is good reason for doing so. In other words, if we're sanctioning somebody or looking to sanction somebody, surely we would want to freeze their assets to prevent them from getting rid of them before a full order is put in place. And at the moment, as I understand it, that can't happen.
The 6-month implementation period makes absolutely no sense. We're trying to rush this through. We here are going to sit until, I don't know what time tonight or tomorrow morning, to make this emergency legislation happen. But we're still giving people 6 months to do this. You know, the government's taking so long that there are activists who are actually going into oligarchs' mansions and seizing them in London and in Paris at the moment to house refugees.
I do not accept that it's appropriate or indeed necessary for ministers to have a power to freeze someone's funds simply because they are being, quote, considered, unquote, for sanctions. That, in my view, would be an unacceptably broad power which would be quite impossible to reconcile with the rule of law.
So that was the debate in the Lords. What happened with the bill in the end?
Yeah, well, there were compromises and assurances. In fact, there's going to be another economic crime bill. So opposition parties were pretty happy with it in the end, and they want to see it made law as well. So it whizzed through its other stages, through the Lords and the Commons, at about 10 to 1 in the morning.
Oh, very
on
late.
Tuesday.
Forgotten about all those very late night sittings.
I haven't. It got royal assent. I do hope they didn't have to actually wake the Queen up to get that. So it became law. And the very next day, well, the same day really, the Tuesday, several hundred more people were sanctioned.
Thanks very much, Susan. Let's go to Cardiff now, find out what's been happening in the Welsh Parliament with our correspondent, James Williams. Hello, James. We've been talking a few moments ago about support for refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine. It was also a big issue at First Minister's Questions this week.
Yeah, as you'd expect, Jo, there's been a lot of focus on the Russian invasion of Ukraine here in the Senedd. Lots of questions to the Welsh Government about preparatory work ahead of Ukrainian refugees arriving here in Wales. The First Minister saying that a lot of work has been done with councils and so on. For example, translating information about access to mental health services into Ukrainian and Russian. Train travel is being made free here in Wales for Ukrainian refugees and so on. Energy dependency was Plaid Cymru leader Adam Price's focus as he expressed concern about the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's visit to Saudi Arabia earlier this week for talks about ending the reliance on Russian oil and gas. So let's hear from the First Minister and Plaid Cymru leader Adam Price.
We hope to create a way in which people coming to Wales will receive an initial period of support and reorientation where we can make sure that those public services are aligned to their needs, where they themselves can simply regroup for a short while. It's impossible to imagine, isn't it, really, what it must be like to find yourself transported across a continent, finding yourself, no matter how welcoming the context will be, when only a few short weeks ago you were living absolutely peaceful lives and couldn't imagine that this was about to happen to you.
The Saudi government, it's believed, will seek assurances that their policy in Yemen for the last 8 years of bombing innocent civilians will not be obstructed by the UK. Do you agree, First Minister, it would be wholly wrong for the Prime Minister to seek to appease one dictatorship fuelled by dirty money in order to resist another?
Now, in response to Adam Price's question, the First Minister once again reiterated his stance that there needs to be a major push now on renewable energy. And of course, the Prime Minister has justified his visit to Saudi Arabia, saying that he raised the issue of the country's human rights and that it's right now that the UK and Western countries look for alternative sources of fuel.
James, let's stick with FMQs, but on a different subject entirely, because the Welsh Conservatives raised a report looking at failings at a health board in North Wales. What's the background to that?
Yeah, so Betsy Cadwallader Health Board, which runs the NHS in North Wales, well, it's been beset with problems. It was in special measures, which is the highest level of government intervention, for more than 5 years up until the end of 2020, partly because of the way that mental health services have been run there. And, you know, opposition parties, campaigners are saying that it needs to go back into special measures, particularly in light of recent reports about the deaths of 2 mental health patients in North Wales, a point raised by the Leader of the Opposition.
One patient took their own life and the other died through what looks like neglect. These deaths were as recently as 2021, just months after the then Health Minister took the Health Board out of special measures, a direct result from your government. After having this time to reflect on the report and its findings, do you, like me, believe that the families are owed an apology from both the Health Board and the Welsh Government that their loved ones were not looked after in a better way?
The First Minister accepting that an apology was necessary and saying that, he's disappointed at the speed of the recovery of the mental health services in North Wales.
James, there was also a debate about the cost of living and in particular the impact on school pupils. How did that come about?
Yeah, so this was a Plaid Cymru tabled debate here in the Senedd on Wednesday. They are concerned that the cost of living crisis, that is an issue, of course, around the UK, is exacerbating the costs associated with the school day. So think about things like school uniforms, PE kits, school meals and so on. And they've suggested to the Welsh Government that they cancel school dinner debts that parents may have and perhaps look at rolling out a little bit quicker the joint Welsh Labour Government and Plaid Cymru cooperation deal policy of giving all primary school pupils free meals. That's going to be rolled out over the next 3 years. They're asking the government to look a little bit quicker at rolling that out. Also during the debate, we heard a lot of Senedd members talking about their own personal experiences of dealing with poverty, as we can hear now.
I myself have really struggled as a single mother with my first child, so I'm all too aware that this government needs to reach those areas that we're not reaching at the moment because of the postcode lottery of a lot of schemes that are available.
You do not go to school on the days of no uniform days because you don't want to ask your parents for £1 in order to not have to wear a uniform. That's what life is like. I mean, and that is like what life shouldn't be like. I speak from personal experience on it. I don't want other children to go through it.
When I came into Comp, when I was in Chweched Llanhari, although I was interested in politics, I still wouldn't have believed that I'd be here now. But that support that had been given to me from a young age, through free school meals, through EMA, I maintain is one of the reasons why I'm here right now. But today, that support, although improving through universal free school meals, for example, is still lacking.
Now, in response, the Welsh Government drew attention to some of its policies. For example, a one-off £100 payments to parents who are struggling to pay the bills so that they can help pay for their children's PE kit. But Welsh ministers basically saying, look, the main economic levers are in the Chancellor's hands, so all eyes now on next week's spring statement.
Thank you very much, James. James Williams there at the Senedd. Let's go to Belfast now and catch up with our Ireland correspondent, Chris Page. Chris, we've been looking at pressures on the cost of living across the UK already on the programme. How's the debate unfolding in Northern Ireland?
Well, Joe, it's very much worth remembering that here in Northern Ireland, all the indicators of social deprivation tend to be higher than in other parts of the UK. And also Northern Ireland has the lowest average wage of the UK's four nations. That means any rise in the cost of living is going to be felt particularly strongly here. There's also the political context. There isn't currently a fully functioning devolved government here at Stormont following the resignation of the DUP's Paul Givan as First Minister a number of weeks ago. The DUP under its leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson said that was really its only leverage to convince the government in Westminster and the EU to scrap the Northern Ireland Protocol, the post-Brexit trade border in the Irish Sea. But other parties are accusing the DUP of putting its electoral interests above people's welfare. Now, in the absence of a First and Deputy First Minister, the budget hasn't been signed off. There's currently £300 million sitting unspent. The Sinn Féin Finance Minister Conor Murphy says that cannot be released for spending without full executive approval. Ministers have approved a £200 payment to hard-pressed families in Northern Ireland to help with the rising energy costs. The SDLP has said that £200 payment should be extended to every household in Northern Ireland. So let's hear a little bit of the debates in the Chamber this week, starting with John O'Dowd of Sinn Féin.
It's no exaggeration to say that there will be children going to school this morning who will feel heat for the first time since Friday. And it's not because they have bad parents or uncaring parents. It's because they have parents who simply cannot afford to heat the home and feed their children. That's the situation we are in 2022. We have families who can't afford to turn the gas on, spending £40 a week to turn the gas on for 3 hours a day. And all this is going on while the executive, if it was functioning, could immediately issue £300 million out into the public's hands, into their pockets and into their wallets. But instead, we have Jeffrey's world. Jeffrey's world where the protocol and opposition to the protocol is more important than the needs of men, women and children.
The DUP is always prepared to look at all solutions, including legislation both here and in Westminster. The problem is not the lack of a First Minister, but the lack of political agreement from some to table and support a plan that delivers for hard-pressed households across Northern Ireland. Actions, not words, will help those in need. Decisions, not delays, will provide the mechanisms to deliver this support. A plan, not political positioning, is the basis of moving this forward.
Deputy Speaker, there's nobody in this chamber needs £200 to help them pay their electricity or gas bill. That's the reality of it. Any money that this Assembly can and should distribute has to go to the most people in need in Northern Ireland, and not everyone is in need in Northern Ireland, and we need to recognise that. So schemes that come forward need to be targeted, and they need to be completely targeted at those in need.
And we can very much expect the intensity of debate on that particular matter to increase, given that we're now heading into the final week of the Assembly sitting here before it dissolves ahead of the Assembly elections on the 5th of May.
Absolutely, Chris. I mean, there was also a debate this week about the Irish language, particularly in the context of registering births, deaths and marriages. How did that come about?
Yes, well, the Irish language, cultural issues, very much a point of disagreement amongst the parties in the power-sharing executive. Broadly, unionists are not in favour of legislation to protect and promote the Irish language. Other parties are. And this week, two MLAs, Jim Allister, the leader of the traditional unionist Voice, and Jim Wells, who's in the DUP but hasn't had the party whip for 4 years, brought forward a proposal to revoke a provision so that people can have their births, marriages and deaths registered in Irish if they want to. And rather predictably, the discussion did get quite heated.
The Department of Finance decided to spend £261,000 to upgrade an IT system to facilitate this, and presumed, and that's the point about process, presumed the support of the committee and of the Assembly to retrospectively put in place that upon which they had already spent £261,000. £261,000, Deputy Speaker, would employ 8 nurses for a year. What was the demonstrable demand for this facility? And here the story gets even more astounding, because the answer was, we've had 1 or 2 calls a month.
I am an Irish speaker, proud of it, raised with Irish, the native language of this country, as my first language. I was educated entirely through Irish medium education. I and other Irish speakers are fully entitled to use our language and to be equally and to equality of treatment in doing just that. In a few days from now, and you've had your time, I don't think you need to be given the stage for any more. In a few days from now, the clocks go forward. Hopefully the two Jims will take that on board and reset their clocks from 1690, 1921, or whatever unionist heyday they still bizarrely want us all to live in.
So the strength of feeling there gives you an idea why the main parties haven't been able to agree legislation at Stormont on the Irish language, even though it was set out in the plan to restore devolution in January 2020 after the Assembly collapsed for 3 years. So the Westminster government says it is committed to bringing forward legislation in Parliament in London. Identity issues will always be prominent in election campaigns here, but there's no doubt that over the last few weeks, economic issues, inflation, rising energy costs have come to the fore in a way that few people perhaps could have expected just a month or two ago.
Thank you very much. Chris Page there at Stormont. Let's return to Westminster and Susan. We've been looking at some of the ramifications of the war in Ukraine already, as we've discussed, in terms of the humanitarian response and also economic sanctions. Another important aspect of the crisis is, of course, energy policy, and that led the Prime Minister to visit Saudi Arabia this week, didn't it?
Yes, and very awkward timing for him, as I shall explain. So, of course, war and invasion of Ukraine has meant that oil and gas imports from Russia are not an option. Not that the UK imports a great deal, but it has led to these soaring global energy prices. So the Prime Minister has been heading off to Saudi Arabia, which does have a lot of this stuff. However, although Saudi Arabia is an ally, it is quite a difficult ally because of its human rights record. And shortly before his visit, it was announced that the state had executed 81 men in just one day. That's more than in the whole of the previous year. And indeed, just before he arrived, there were another 3 people executed. So there were some very grave concerns raised about that in the House of Commons and from his own side as well.
Does my right honourable friend agree that this represents a new low for human rights and criminal justice in the Kingdom, coming only a week after the Crown Prince had promised to modernise the Saudi justice system?
The UK's relationship with Saudi Arabia is of great importance, ranging from kind of national security to economic interests. But that nature of our relationship does mean that we can speak frankly about human rights.
We've seen what happens when human rights abuses go unchecked. So I ask the Minister what steps the government is taking to ensure that human rights are at the fore of any future trade deals with Saudi Arabia. And will the Prime Minister be expressing Parliament's outrage at this massacre when he meets the Crown Prince? And what assurances will the government be seeking to ensure that such mass executions carried out by a friendly country never happen again?
I'm glad to hear the Minister say that there's a frank dialogue with the Saudis about judicial matters, but it doesn't, I say this gently, seem to be having much of an effect on the Saudis themselves. And friends speak bluntly to friends, and executing in public by beheading 81 people, whatever their crime, whatever their alleged crime, is an atrocity.
We were shocked by the execution of these 81 individuals, and our ambassador has raised strong concerns of the UK government with the Saudi National Security Advisor and their Vice Foreign Minister.
Actions do speak louder than words. If the Prime Minister goes in the next few days to Saudi Arabia, we will be sending a very clear signal that no matter what we say, we're not really bothered about this sort of thing.
Now, we've got time to bring you one more story. There was a strange exchange, Susan, in the House of Lords this week. What happened?
Now, we were mentioning earlier about the fact that they keep sitting very late in the House of Lords, well past midnight. In fact, it's sometimes 2 or 3 in the morning. And actually, the opposition was complaining about that to the government and saying this is no way to make laws and to do business, and they needed to manage things a lot better. However, on that marathon session on Monday evening, that we were talking about, there was one Labour peer was accused of having dozed off. He was accused of this very publicly by a government whip, very embarrassing for him. He has said subsequently that he wasn't asleep at all, that he was just leaning back to listen. They have these little loudspeakers in the backs of their seats, and he was leaning back to hear better because his hearing aids weren't working. However, let's see what happened.
But if there's 2 things that I welcome in coming out of the common market, one is the CAP, and this particular gene editing.
I'm sorry, but the Noble Lord was fast asleep for the entire duration of the Minister's speech. He really should not participate in this debate, having failed to take advantage of the ability to hear it. I'm afraid the Noble Lord was fast asleep for the entirety of the Minister's opening speech. Well, I had to send a note to you in order to wake you up by the doorkeeper.
Oh, duly told off there. Well, that's all for this week for the UK Roundup. I'll be back on Monday at 12:15 with Politics Live. Until then, have a very good weekend.